Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a calm little stroll, maybe more of a slow trudge, back to the Middle Ages. So dim the lights, pour some tea, and get cozy because I'm about to explain why you, yes you, with your 24/7 Wi-Fi, oat milk lattes, and memory foam mattress, wouldn't last a single day in medieval Europe. And don't worry, this isn't going to be loud or dramatic. Just a gentle bedtime wander through filth, fleas, and dynastic disasters. Think of it as a history lullaby with plague. Now, people like to romanticize the medieval world. Knights in shining armor, maidens in towers, banquets with roast swan on golden plates. But if you actually found yourself plopped down in 13th century Paris, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the smell of lutes floating in the breeze. It would be the smell. And then you'd faint. And then you'd probably never wake up, because fainting in a medieval street was basically an open invitation for dysentery, robbery, or both. Let's start with the basics. Hygiene. Or rather, the complete absence of it. Forget hot showers. Forget even lukewarm bucket baths. Most medieval Europeans considered bathing suspicious at best, sinful at worst. Water was thought to open your pores and let diseases sneak in. So naturally, the solution was, don't wash. Just cover yourself in linen underclothes and hope the dirt sort of stuck to the fabric instead of you. Spoiler, it didn't. People stank. Royalty stank. Nobles stank. Even the saints, possibly especially the saints, stank. And then there were the streets. Picture a city where the sanitation department is just pigs. Actual pigs. Wandering around, snuffling up garbage and whatever waste people threw out their windows. A medieval town had no plumbing, no drains, and no real trash system. If you're lucky, there's a ditch. If you're not lucky, which, let's be real, you're not, there's just muck, and you're standing in it. That's where our ancestors lived, worked, and made all those romantic love ballads. But hey, maybe you're thinking, that's okay, I'll just hang out with the nobility. They had castles, right? Yes, but a castle is basically just a drafty stone refrigerator with no insulation and about 50 chamber pots. There was no central heating, so winters meant huddling under damp wool blankets while your breath frosted in front of you. If you were lucky enough to be at court, you'd be packed in with dozens of other noble families, their servants, and a small army of rodents who also thought the castle was prime real estate. Mice and lice were the real nobles here. And while we're on castles, let's talk about food. You might have seen movies where kings sit at endless feasts with golden goblets and platters of roast boar. Technically true, but let me explain what that food actually tasted like. Meat was often half spoiled by the time it got to the table. The fancy spices were there not just for flavor, but to cover up the fact that the venison was basically going bad. Bread wasn't fluffy sourdough either. It was coarse, hard, and sometimes bulked out with things like ground beans or chalk. Yes, chalk. For texture. Delicious. If you were poor, which most people were, you weren't eating roast boar at all. You were eating pottage, which is essentially medieval oatmeal, except replace the oats with whatever root vegetables you scraped out of the dirt and cook it until it's one step away from glue. That was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Every day. Bon appetit. Now, let's drift over to medicine, or as I like to call it, medieval guesswork with extra leeches. If you got sick, your options included being bled until you fainted, being purged until you fainted, or being prayed over until you fainted. Doctors genuinely thought the body was controlled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If those were out of balance, your doctor would happily bleed you with a knife, or apply a nice hot pigeon carcass to your chest. That's not a joke. Pigeon therapy was real. If you had tuberculosis, someone might strap a freshly slaughtered bird to your skin because, well, why not? And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, plague.
Bubonic plague rolled in like the world's darkest house guest in the 14th century. It killed about half of Europe, sometimes within a week. Picture boils the size of apples, fevers that left you delirious, and neighbors literally dropping in the street. The Black Death was so bad that people stopped burying bodies properly because there were just too many of them. Cemeteries overflowed. Mass pits became the new normal. And if you didn't catch plague, there were still dozens of other delightful illnesses waiting. Smallpox, dysentery, ergot poisoning from moldy bread. Basically, medieval life was one long obstacle course of death. But maybe you're resilient. Maybe you're thinking, okay, but at least people had community, faith, purpose. Sure, they also had taxes. Endless taxes. Lords taxed peasants, kings taxed lords, and the church taxed everyone. Tithes, rents, fees for grinding your grain, fees for using a bridge, fees for existing. And if you couldn't pay, jail, or worse. Debt was practically a hereditary disease. Families passed it on like heirlooms. Forget your mortgage. Try owing feudal dues that your great-grandfather racked up. And here's a fun one, marriage. Today we talk about marrying for love. In medieval Europe, love was something you maybe wrote a poem about while your parents arranged to sell you off at age 12 for some land rights. The average noble marriage had the emotional warmth of a property exchange. And because royalty loved keeping things in the family, you got generations of inbreeding, which meant delightful results like the Habsburg jaw, an actual medical condition where your chin juts so far out it could probably be used as a coat hook. Charles II of Spain was famously so inbred that doctors weren't even sure how he was still alive. Spoiler? Not very well.
And don't get me started on childhood, because childhood didn't really exist. You were basically considered a tiny adult as soon as you could walk. Peasant kids worked the fields. Noble kids were pawns in dynastic games. A happy childhood might mean not dying before age 5, which a terrifying number of children didn't manage. Infant mortality was so high that parents often didn't even name babies until they survived a year or two. Why get attached? So yes, if you're still picturing yourself in medieval Europe, just know this. You'd be cold, smelly, hungry, and constantly terrified of catching something incurable. And you'd have absolutely no toothpaste. That's right, forget minty fresh breath. Medieval dental care meant, at best, rubbing your teeth with a cloth dipped in wine. Cavities? You either lived with them or someone yanked the tooth out with pliers, without anesthesia. Sweet dreams. And yet, people did survive, somehow. They built cathedrals, told stories, sang songs, fell in love, occasionally even for real, which honestly is kind of impressive when you realize that 99% of their lives were spent wading through mud, malnutrition, and fleas. So why wouldn't you last a day in medieval times? Because you'd make it about an hour before crying for antibiotics, indoor plumbing, and an Uber. The Middle Ages weren't the romantic fairy tale you've seen in movies. They were grim, messy, and endlessly inconvenient, which makes the fact that our ancestors kept going, kept building and dreaming, all the more strange and, in a sleepy way, kind of inspiring. Anyway, let's float now from the general misery of medieval daily life into the more specific miseries of the royals themselves. Because if you thought peasants had it rough, wait until you hear about kings and queens with genetic time bombs ticking inside them. Spoiler, it's a lot of collapsing thrones, fragile egos, and family trees that looked more like tangled knots.
So we've gently trudged through the everyday misery of medieval life. Mud, lice, spoiled food, death at every corner. But now let's climb a few rungs up the social ladder. Not that it helps much, because if you thought peasants had it bad, let's talk about the royal families. These were the people who, in theory, had all the power, all the wealth, and all the castles. In reality, they mostly had gout, cousins for spouses, and bloodlines so tangled you could knit a sweater out of them. Let's start with everyone's favorite dynasty of genetic experiments, the Habsburgs. They ruled vast swaths of Europe for centuries, including Spain, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire. And they had one simple strategy for keeping power in the family: marry each other. Cousins, uncles, nieces. If it had the right crest on the family tree, you were fair game. Apparently, Tinder in the 1500s had a filter that just said, "genetic disaster waiting to happen." Now, the Habsburgs are most famous for their jaws. Not, unfortunately, because of their biting wit. The Habsburg jaw was a real, medically documented deformity caused by generations of inbreeding. Imagine a chin so oversized and jutted that closing your mouth is basically optional. Some Habsburg portraits show rulers with lips that couldn't actually meet, which sounds mildly inconvenient, but when you add in chewing, swallowing, and, breathing, it's less than ideal. Enter Charles II of Spain, the poster child for inbreeding gone wrong. Charles was the great-great-great-grandson of himself, basically. By the time he was born in 1661, his family tree looked like a tangled knot someone left in a drawer. His jaw was so distorted that he could barely chew. His tongue was so large that speaking clearly was almost impossible. He didn't walk until age 8, and he didn't learn to read until his teens. One observer bluntly described him as short, ugly, and completely incapable of ruling, which is not really what you want on your royal resume. Charles's reign was one long, slow-motion collapse. He suffered constant illnesses, seizures, and depression. His court physicians tried every remedy they could think of, from bleeding him to pouring potions down his throat. At one point, they even diagnosed him as bewitched, which, honestly, given his genetic situation, might have been the kindest explanation. He died childless at 38, bringing the Spanish Habsburg line to an end. In the end, the only legacy Charles left was proof that marrying your niece isn't a sustainable political strategy.
But the Habsburgs weren't alone in this. The French royals were also experts at family entanglements. Let's float over to France for a bit. You might have heard of Charles VI, nicknamed Charles the Mad. Not a great sign. He became king as a child in the late 14th century, and at first, things looked promising. Young Charles was handsome, athletic, and popular. Then, at age 24, he had his first psychotic episode. Out of nowhere, while leading his men through a forest, Charles suddenly turned on his own knights and began hacking at them with his sword. Several died before he was restrained. From then on, Charles's mental health spiraled. He suffered from delusions, paranoia, and violent fits. Sometimes he thought he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. He forgot his own name. He forgot he was king. Once he ran screaming through the palace corridors until he collapsed from exhaustion. He'd go through periods of lucidity only to relapse into total madness. And yet Charles was married off, of course he was, to Isabeau of Bavaria. They had 12 children. 12! Which is impressive, given that Charles often didn't recognize his own wife, or himself, or reality. But hey, dynasty first, right? The kids weren't exactly lucky either. Some inherited their father's instability. Others were pawns in endless wars and political marriages. One daughter, Catherine, was married off to Henry V of England, the guy famous for Agincourt. She ended up widowed at 20, tossed aside in the endless Anglo-French tug-of-war. Now let's float north to England for a moment, because English royals weren't much better. Take Henry VI. Poor Henry. He was the grandson of Charles VI, yes, the made-of-glass king of France. Genetics are a cruel mistress. Henry inherited the crown as a baby in 1422, which is always a recipe for chaos. He grew up timid, pious, and utterly unfit for kingship. Unlike his warrior grandfather, Henry V, who had been all about battles and glory, Henry VI was more interested in prayer and charity. Noble qualities for a monk, less so for a medieval king. When Henry was in his early 30s, he had a complete mental breakdown. For over a year, he sat in silence, unresponsive, not recognizing anyone, not even his newborn son. Government had to be run by a regency council. Eventually, he recovered, but he relapsed several times. His reign spiraled into the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic family feud that turned England into a blood-soaked chessboard. So, thank you, Charles VI of France, for passing on the family madness like a cursed heirloom.
Meanwhile, in Central Europe, let's not forget about poor King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia. Wenceslas had a drinking problem so legendary that even his contemporaries complained. He was nicknamed the Lazy because he rarely bothered to govern, preferring instead to drink himself into oblivion. His court was a circus of excess, and rebellions broke out constantly. At one point, he was kidnapped by his own nobles and imprisoned, which says a lot about how much confidence they had in his leadership. Royal dysfunction wasn't always just in the mind, though. Sometimes it was in the body. Let's circle back to the Tudors. Henry VIII is remembered for his 6 wives and general appetite for destruction. But by his later years, he was also a physical wreck. Obese, ulcer-ridden, possibly suffering from diabetes, and carried around on a mechanical chair. His legendary temper tantrums became more frequent as his health declined, making court life a minefield for anyone who annoyed him. Imagine working for a boss who might order your beheading just because his leg ulcer was acting up. Sleep tight. And of course, behind all this chaos was the royal obsession with heirs. Producing sons was the medieval royal equivalent of renewing your Netflix subscription, non-negotiable. Except in this case, if you didn't manage it, you could literally lose your head. Which brings us back, again, to Henry VIII and his poor wives, 2 of whom ended up executed simply for failing to provide healthy male heirs. So yes, royalty might have had silks and jewels, but the pressure cooker of dynastic survival was enough to make anyone crack. So when we talk about why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times, let's also remember, you probably wouldn't want to last a day as a king or queen either. Because if plague, famine, and bad bread didn't get you, your own family might. Either by marrying you to your cousin, stabbing you in a succession war, or handing down a charming case of hereditary insanity. But don't worry, we've only just scratched the surface of royal dysfunction. In the next part, we'll drift into the lives of medieval children, those sad, sickly heirs who were usually treated less like kids and more like chess pieces with tiny crowns glued on. Spoiler, most of them didn't make it past age 10.
Let's start with the numbers, because they set the tone pretty quickly. In medieval Europe, up to half of all children died before the age of 10. Half! So if you were a medieval parent, the odds were basically like flipping a coin for every birth. Heads, the kid makes it past the first year. Tails, time to try again. It was so bleak that many parents didn't even bother naming their babies until they had survived infancy. Why get attached to something that might not last the winter? But for royals, the stakes were even higher. A peasant losing a child was a tragedy. A king losing a child was a succession crisis. Dynasties lived or died based on whether these fragile, sickly little heirs managed to avoid smallpox, plague, and the occasional suspicious accident, which meant royal children grew up in a strange mix of extreme privilege and constant danger. Take, for example, Edward VI of England. Poor Edward. He was the only legitimate son of Henry VIII, the guy with the 6 wives and the temper tantrums. Edward was a frail, pale child who spent most of his short life swaddled in heavy robes, being shuffled between tutors, priests, and physicians. He became king at just 9 years old. 9! Which is about the age most kids today are discovering Minecraft, not being handed an entire kingdom. Edward's reign lasted a grand total of 6 years before he died of tuberculosis at 15. His coughing fits were so violent that he reportedly spat blood into cloths day and night. The court doctors did what medieval doctors always did. They bled him, purged him, and prayed. None of it worked. By the end, Edward was so weak that he could barely move, let alone rule. But don't worry, a whole civil war over his succession made sure his death was anything but peaceful. Sweet dreams, Edward. Now, let's drift over to France for a moment. Louis XIII, the future father of the Sun King, was another royal child who grew up under constant pressure.
He was born frail, plagued by digestive problems, and his mother, Marie de Medici, basically treated him like a fragile porcelain doll. By the time he became king at 9, he was shy, awkward, and utterly unprepared. To make matters worse, his famous father, Henry VIII of France, had been assassinated when Louis was just a boy. So little Louis had to grow up fast, or at least pretend to, while powerful nobles ran the kingdom around him. He eventually developed a love of hunting and war, but physically and emotionally, he was a bundle of nerves his entire life. Imagine being handed France when you can't even handle solid food.
And of course, we can't forget Spain again. Let's talk about Don Carlos, son of King Philip II. Don Carlos was supposed to be the golden heir to one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Instead, he became one of history's strangest cautionary tales. From the start, Carlos was sickly. He had a deformed spine, one leg shorter than the other, and he suffered repeated fevers as a child. Add in the Habsburg inbreeding, and you get a recipe for disaster. As a teenager, Carlos's behavior grew increasingly alarming. He was violent, paranoid, and prone to sudden rages. He once tried to burn down the palace. He attacked servants. He even plotted against his own father. At one point, he tried to kidnap a noblewoman he fancied, which went about as well as you'd expect. Eventually, Philip had him locked away in a castle dungeon, where Carlos wasted away and died at just 23. For all the tutors, jewels, and palaces he had, Don Carlos lived like a cursed character in a tragic play. But let's zoom out a little. Even if you weren't physically deformed or dangerously unstable, being a royal child was still exhausting. You were constantly being groomed, not in the fun Disney prince way, but in the memorized Latin declensions before breakfast way. Education was brutal. You were drilled in theology, politics, and military skills before you were old enough to ride a horse without falling off. And always there was the marriage contract looming in the background. Royal children were betrothed as toddlers, sometimes even as infants. You could be 3 years old and already promised to marry some distant cousin across the continent that you'd never even met. Diplomatic alliances were more important than your personal happiness. And if your fiancé died, congratulations. You were probably being rebetrothed before the mourning period was even over. Princesses had it especially grim. Take poor Margaret Beaufort in England, married off at just 12 years old to a man twice her age. She nearly died giving birth to her only son, Henry Tudor. That pregnancy left her so damaged that she never had another child. And yet through sheer willpower, she became the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty. Still, 12 is an age where you should be worrying about, climbing trees, not producing heirs to the throne. And let's not forget all the heirs who simply didn't make it. The number of little princes and princesses buried in tiny coffins is staggering. Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, had at least 6 pregnancies. Only one child, Mary, survived infancy. Queen Anne of Great Britain later had 17 pregnancies. 17. Every single one of her children either died stillborn, in infancy, or before reaching adulthood. It's hard to overstate how much grief and instability this created for the monarchy. And Anne had to keep smiling through court ceremonies while her nursery was basically a revolving door of heartbreak. And for those kids who did survive, congratulations, you now had the weight of an entire kingdom pressing down on your fragile little shoulders. Every cough, every fever, every fall from a horse sent shockwaves of panic through your dynasty. Because if you didn't survive, entire wars could break out over who got to sit on your little gilded chair. So yes, medieval royal children might have had jeweled cradles, golden rattles, and entire armies of wet nurses. But underneath the silk, they were fragile, overworked, and often doomed to dying before the crown ever touched their head. In a way, their lives were even sadder than those of peasant kids. At least a peasant child could run barefoot in the fields and play with sticks. A royal child was too busy coughing up blood while learning Latin verbs and waiting to be shipped off to marry their cousin.
And that's the gentle tragedy of medieval royal childhood. Spoiled in theory, but in reality, sickly, lonely, and constantly at risk of dying before the crown ever touched their head. Now, let's slowly drift toward the world of royal marriages themselves. Because if childhood was grim, adulthood was basically a parade of awkward wedding nights, power plays, and dynastic chess moves that make modern dating apps look downright sane.
Welcome back. So far, we've wandered through mud-filled streets, fragile monarchs, and children who barely made it past the cradle. Now, let's tuck ourselves into one of the most important and most disastrous aspects of medieval monarchy: marriage. And not the romantic comedy kind of marriage. Royal marriages were basically business contracts with crowns attached. The goal wasn't happiness. It was power, land, and ideally, lots of heirs. Whether you liked the person you were marrying was about as relevant as whether your soup had too many leeches in it. And of course, all these dynastic deals had consequences. Because when you keep marrying your cousins for centuries, you don't just keep the land in the family, you keep the genes in the family. Which is how we end up with half a dozen monarchs who look like their family tree was drawn in a circle. Let's start again with the Habsburgs, because they really are the gold standard of marrying wrong. We already met poor Charles II of Spain, the man whose DNA was basically a sad game of Jenga. But how did it get that bad? Well, his parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. Yes, uncle and niece. Which meant Charles had fewer unique ancestors in his family tree than most of us have in one Thanksgiving photo. By the time Charles was born, entire branches of the Habsburg lineage had folded back on themselves. This wasn't just bad luck, it was policy. The Spanish Habsburgs deliberately arranged these marriages to keep power centralized. Cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, repeat for generations. The result was Charles, who had the genetic diversity of a puddle and the health record of a medieval compost heap. He couldn't walk properly, struggled to speak, and had an IQ that one historian politely described as limited, which is academic speak for absolutely not qualified to run an empire. But Spain wasn't alone in this. Let's float gently over to Portugal, where King Afonso VI reigned in the 17th century. Afonso had been paralyzed as a child from some illness, maybe meningitis, maybe syphilis, and he never really recovered. He was partially paralyzed on one side, mentally unstable, and, to top it off, impotent. His marriage to Maria Francisca of Savoy ended in scandal when she claimed the king was unable to consummate the union, which is courtly language for nothing happened in the royal bed. She eventually divorced him and married his younger brother, who promptly shoved Afonso aside and took the crown. So, bad genes, bad politics, bad outcome.
And then there's France. Let's talk about Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. He actually dodged most of the genetic disasters personally, but his marriage tells you a lot about how dynasties worked. Louis married Maria Teresa of Spain, who, surprise, was his double first cousin. That means their parents were siblings on both sides. Double the family, double the fun, double the potential for inherited problems. Their marriage was meant to seal peace between France and Spain. But what it really sealed was more inbreeding into the royal DNA pool. Out of their 6 children, only 1 survived to adulthood. The rest died of smallpox, measles, or just sheer fragility. And while we're here, let's glance at England again. Remember poor Henry VIII? His marriages weren't genetically disastrous so much as just disastrous. But even he couldn't escape the dynastic chess game. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon was a textbook case of politics over love. Catherine had first been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur. When Arthur died young, because of course he did, Henry married the widow to keep the Spanish alliance intact. This worked fine until Catherine couldn't give him a surviving son,
at which point Henry decided God was mad at him for marrying his brother's wife. Convenient, but also a little ironic, given how many other royal families were out here marrying actual nieces. Henry's solution, of course, was to invent a whole new church so he could divorce her. And then the next 5 marriages didn't exactly go better. The whole mess left England with 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and 1 sickly son, Edward, who, as we know, died as a teenager. So, all that dynastic drama for not much. Now let's drift east to the Russian court, because if you thought Western Europe had monopoly on bad marriages, think again. Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, had 8 wives. Yes, 8. 2 were poisoned, 1 was drowned, 1 was sent to a convent, and a few probably wished they'd been poisoned. Ivan's marital life was less about romance and more about creating a conveyor belt of misery. His children didn't fare much better. His heir, Ivan Ivanovich, was killed by Ivan himself during a fit of rage, which is one way to solve a succession crisis, I suppose. Royal marriages weren't just unhealthy for genetics, they were also unhealthy for the actual people trapped in them. Queens were often treated as baby-making machines, expected to churn out heirs until their bodies literally gave out. Princesses were shipped across borders as political packages, torn away from their families and sent to live in cold, foreign courts where no one spoke their language. Imagine being 15, barely literate, and suddenly you're queen of somewhere you can't even pronounce. Romantic, right? Even when the marriages weren't outright hostile, they were rarely happy. Take Philip II of Spain, again, who married 4 different women. His marriage to Mary I of England, Bloody Mary, was a particularly bleak one. Mary was already in her late 30s, desperate for a child, and clung to Philip like her entire reign depended on him, which, unfortunately, it kind of did. She experienced multiple phantom pregnancies, her belly swelling, symptoms of labor, only for there to be no baby. It was heartbreaking, and Philip spent most of his time avoiding her, preferring to manage his other kingdoms. Their marriage produced nothing but disappointment and reinforced the stereotype of miserable royal unions. So yes, medieval and early modern royal marriages might have looked glamorous from the outside, jeweled gowns, golden crowns, lavish banquets, but underneath the glitter, they were awkward, loveless, and genetically questionable. A lot of silk sheets, very little actual happiness. And over time, all that cousin marrying had consequences. Fragile heirs, dynastic collapses, and some of the most awkward family portraits in history. Now, let's float onward, because if marriages were messy, the next stage of royal life was even grimmer: old age, or rather, the lack of it. Because monarchs didn't just live short, difficult lives. Many of them spent their final years in decay, madness, or wrapped in so many bandages you'd think they were practicing for mummification.